What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 341. That's right, number 3 for 1. I'm one of your Limited Resources. I'm Marshall. I am back home, no longer in Las Vegas. I'm home in my luxurious home studio, also known as my living room. And joining me, also not where he was before, it's Luis Scott-Vargas from L.A. You're down in L.A. At E3.
Actually, yeah, technically I'm in Pasadena since apparently that's where we're staying. But I am broadcasting live from E3. I've been at E3 all week, and we'll continue to be that since we're recording this on a Tuesday.
Very, very cool. And so just a quick note, Luis is on that super solid hotel internet, so if he cuts out a time or two during the show, please do bear with us for that. So we've got a fun show lined up. We kind of made a big deal out of the episode 241, which was the 2-for-1 show, value, right? And so we figured we'd touch on some of the same things here in episode 341. We didn't go crazy, but we've got some fun stuff, and I think it's going to be a good one. I want to remind
no guarantees on episode 441, but there's just not that many 4-for-1s.
No, we did find one though, Opportunity.
Yeah, you tried to submit that here in episode 3. I'm like, sorry, man.
I overshot. I know. I was like, oh wait, yeah, that's too much value. Before we get into all that, I do want to remind you that the show is brought to you by ChannelFireball.com. Make sure you check out Channel Fireball for all your Magic needs. That's right. Great place to go to get any singles you need, sealed product. That's right. Eternal Masters, all that kind of stuff. And supplies. You can get Limited Resources supplies there now. You can get deck boxes, sleeves, and t-shirts for LR to kind of show your values and as it were. Of course, you can also find an awesome host of free content on there. Every day you can find videos, articles, breakdowns of decks, how to sideboard. A really good one went up this week by Paula Vitor Damaderosa, one of the better Magic writers out there, period. And about bluffing and that kind of stuff. Really cool stuff on Channel Fireball. Make sure you check it out. It's all completely free on the content side, which is really nice. I've always appreciated about CFB is that I know I can go there and read the content, and hey, while I'm there, may as well buy some cards. Also, it's brought to you by you via the Patreon, patreon.com/limited resources. You can go there and check out the details. It's real easy to get set up. And in fact, we've recently crossed another threshold, which means that I am getting the ball rolling on doing some video versions of the podcast. I'm going to start off a little slow with it, but we're going to kind of build that up and see where it takes us. So I'm excited for that. I'm coming up with some new stretch goals, and I just wanted to say thank you so much to all the people that support the show and make these cool things happen.
So for the video version of the podcast, do you record like our faces while we're recording, or do you also want to record like my screen as I'm double queuing while I record?
No, I want to record. This is actually just a way to uncover the grisly truth of what percentage of attention we actually get from you. And so your face will be on there, and then I'm brainstorming up some ideas for some other stuff that we can put up on those special video editions as well. And I think it's going to be pretty cool. One of the perks that you get from being a patron is that you get to submit questions for the question of the week. And this one comes from PD Van Shake, who says, "Hey guys, I've been listening for about a year and I have a question about sealed deck and draft to an extent. What advice do you have when the best deck in your sealed pool or the open color in your draft is a color that you simply aren't very good at or just don't like?" And, this is a really interesting question because personal preference is something that we strive to not have, right? Like we don't want it. It's a negative in our Magic worldview, if you will. But at the same time, it is a truth. It does exist. We all have preferences and we all find strengths and weaknesses, within a game as diverse as Magic. And so I thought this would be an interesting topic to hit because, again, we can't just pretend like certain types of strategies, colors, whatever's, appeal to certain gamers' personality types rather than not, right? We shouldn't just dismiss that, even if it is our goal ultimately to be able to play all the different combinations, effectively. So what are your thoughts on this, Luis? Would you, if you were still kind of figuring everything out, would you favor a stronger deck that you didn't think that you were that good with, or would you, favor the colors or the type of deck that you like and stick with that?
This actually does come up a fair amount even actually at like high level play. And the best answer I have is depends what the stakes are of the event you're playing. And let's say you really like drafting white, green, or black, red, but you're not really comfortable drafting anything else. And then you like top 8 at PPTQ, and you've got to draft a deck to try to win the top 8. I would lean you towards drafting the things you're familiar with, because you're drafting a high stakes draft. You're not really trying to learn on the fly. You're trying to win this draft. I think, when PD asks this question about like a sealed league, you should definitely just build the best deck in a sealed league, because part of the purpose of a sealed league is to improve. It's to get better. It's to get over the hump of, oh, I don't like playing blue decks, which is, that's a perfectly fine place to start. But if your goal is improvement, you should learn how to play blue decks. You should play blue decks. So when you're trying to improve, you should push yourself, and that involves playing the colors and the combinations and the decks you're not comfortable with, especially when it's obvious that that's the right one to be playing. When you're trying to win a specific event, that's when I'd be less likely to want to experiment. And one of the things I think we've even talked about before of how to make use of limited time when you're preparing for something is just like learn a deck or two as best you can, and then just play those decks. And yes, that's not the overall best expected value play, because sometimes those decks aren't open, but I would rather know how to draft, white, green, 10 out of 10, even if I could then not draft a bunch of the other decks, just because you'll still have a pretty good shot when that deck is around. So in general, I would say you should just aim for the highest win percentage, aim for building the best deck you can. In a specific event, sticking to your comfort zone is actually a fine strategy.
Yeah, it's a good example of this is my friend Adam. I've mentioned him on the show a bunch of times. Picked up Magic, a year and a half, 2 years ago, and has really taken to it. He drafts all the time, and he's been branching out into different into different strategies, different color combos, here in Shadows over Innistrad. And one of the cool things that also happens is that you will often find things that you weren't aware of that you liked, or that really kind of clicked with your personality or your draft style. And by pushing out into those boundaries, you'll be like, wow, this is where I should have been the whole time. Like, this is how I really enjoy these type of things. And I know that he's done that. He's recently started drafting mill decks. He really likes these, Manic Scribe, Fleeting Memories type builds. And, that was something that just wouldn't even have been close to being on his radar even 6 months ago, or a little longer than that. He was much more of a streamlined kind of mid-range, your normal type of deck. And he started experimenting a bit with those here in Shadows, and he's really taken to them and found that, it does actually fit his profile. So yeah, don't underestimate that too, that you may just find something that works for you there anyway. Okay. So we've got a few things lined up here, for episode 341, and they're going to be fun. We're going to have some fun with this one. Oh, you know what? I want to do a Crack-a-Pack. I almost forgot.
Do you have an Eternal Masters pack?
I don't. I have a Shadows pack.
All right.
I just didn't. I did actually do one Eternal Masters draft with our friends from the Command Zone. Jimmy and Josh and Kenji was there. But the problem is I forgot to say, hey guys, can I buy one of these packs off you or whatever? I'm sure they would have let me. I just didn't remember.
As long as it's clear whose fault it is, that's fine.
It was my fault. I take full blame. So we'll do a Shadows one. This is Jacob from GPLA gave this to us. Thank you so much, Jacob. We'll kind of cruise through this thing, I think. Let's see what we've got here. We've got an Inquisitor's Ox, which I'm going to say...
I think I've played this card maybe 10% of the time I've drafted it. If that even.
It's not that good. Just the Wind, which interestingly has gone down a significant amount for me from before. I've just found that the times when I actually get to madness it don't pop up as often as I like. And even though, I appreciate a good, cheap, interactive spell, a spell that can interact with my opponent's creatures for a cheap amount of mana. I do like that. I do think it's good. And certainly it's gotten better as the actual removal has gotten worse. I still find Just the Wind falling a little bit short for me. And, I'll play one. I'm not looking to first pick it or anything like that.
Agreed.
Cathar's Companion. That's the 3/1 dog. No. Sanitarium Skeleton still only really goes in those specific archetypes that can abuse that type of card. And even then, I find it a card that I find acceptable in those, but still not great,
Yeah, I've never had the deck that I was like, wow, Sanitarium Skeleton, the dream. I've had decks where I feel like I really want one, but it still has never been too absurd for me.
No, I agree. I think it's fine. This card's gone up a lot. You actually turned me on to this card pretty early in the format, which is a simple one. It's just True Faith Sensor, you know? And
yeah, I like the card.
I like the card a lot. I just think it's very solid equipment. Like, I think it's definitely head and shoulders above the other common equipment as well, like Shard of Broken Glass and the Cloak or whatever. I try to stay away from those when possible, but True Faith Sensor is
uncommon and also not a card.
there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why I never played it, but True Faith Sensor is a card I want. Like I actually usually feel pretty good about picking up one or two of these especially in any white deck I end up playing. Magmatic Chasm. Sure. You know, if you need that type of finisher, you can have it, but you don't need to first pick it. Sanguinary Mage, that's the 1/3 prowess for 1 and a red. No,
well, these cards are just behind True Faith Sensor.
Totally. Fork in the Road.
You like the card, but still not more than Sensor.
Yeah. Our last common is Shamble Back, which is also not as good as True Faith Sensor. So let's see if the uncommons can save us. Spectral Shepherd is our first one. That's the 2/2 flying for 2 and a white, and you can pay 1 and a blue to return target spirit you control to its owner's hand.
I'm not in love with this card.
No, it's fine.
I don't know how high you are on the blue-white deck still, but this card's good there. But I would still rather have True Faith Sensor. Just to start out a draft with a colorless card that, yeah, I mean, you're going to pair True Faith Sensor with a white. It's like, it's an off-white card where it goes much better in white decks, but it's still good in like some green decks. And overall, it's still just a fun card.
Yeah, you know, I still like the blue-white deck a decent amount, but Spectral Shepherd is not an important piece of that puzzle. It's fine. Hey, look, it's a Haunted Cloak. Sitting right here in the uncommon slot. No, right? We talked about that.
Yeah,
we want it. Not bad. Woodland Stream. My God, this pack is miserable.
I'm not looking to take a dual land here.
No, that's the blue-green tap land. I'm still on True Faith Sensor. All right, our double face card is decent. It's Town Gossipmonger.
Oh, I do like Town Gossipmonger. I would be inclined to first pick that one. The 1/1 that you can tap it and tap another creature to flip into a 2/3 Incited Rabble. The 2/3 that has to attack, and you can pay 2 colors to get +1/+0. That card's good.
Yeah, that card's good. I like that card too. Our rare, really disappointing, I think overall. It's Diregraph Colossus. 2 and a black, 2/2 zombie giant. Enters a battlefield with +1/+1 counter for each zombie in your graveyard, and whenever you cast a zombie, you get a 2/2 zombie tapped on the battlefield. Man, this thing just seems like it would be super, super sweet, and I just have never, ever gotten it to be awesome. Like, I don't think I've got to make a 2/2 black zombie, or if I have, it's been like 1, and I've maybe gotten a +1/+1 counter on it ever. It just doesn't seem to have a home in the format that really makes it reliably good, at least not in my experience. Also, the deck it goes in kind of stinks.
Yeah, I have been unimpressed with zombies and unimpressed with Diregraph Colossus. It leads to some ridiculous games, and it really only needs to make like 1 zombie to be okay. But
yeah,
it just, I don't know. It's just not a card that's impressed me.
Agreed. So that leaves us with Town Gossipmonger or True Faith Sensor. I think power level wise, the Gossipmonger's the pick. You know, some people may argue that you could stay colorless with True Faith Sensor, but the truth is that card usually ends up going in a white deck anyway. So I think I would just take the Gossipmonger here.
Yeah, I'm on board.
Get in. All right. So that was a pretty easy crack-up pack, mainly because it was so bad. All right. So let's talk about our first little section here, Luis. We're going to talk about our favorite 3-for-1s and what we've learned from them. This is the one that I tried to put opportunity was rebuked by Luis, saying that is in fact a 4-for-1.
Well, you know, before every show, we basically have like an email thread where we like bounce topics off each other and whatnot. And we'd gotten to the stage where like, hey, let's try to generate this list of cards. And you responded, you know, with a list of a bunch of cards. And the only thing I just responded to the email with like, that's not a 3-for-1.
Yeah.
That was just the whole email.
That was
like, let's try that.
I was like, oh, right. Yeah. I tried to sneak a Mana War into my modern deck for Community Super League, and that also didn't work. So I'm not really good at this apparently. All right. So where do you want to start? What are some of our favorite 3-for-1s?
Well, Muldrifter is the kind of the end all be all of 3-for-1s in terms of limited, one. Especially commons. The fact that Muldrifter was a common is kind of mind blowing. This was one of the better uncommons when it got reprinted in Modern Masters. I guess it was Modern Masters 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it was a common in was Lorwyn block that is just I mean, it's a 2/2 that draws 2 cards, so it's a flying divination. You can actually cast as divination too if you want to.
Yep.
It has, synergies with graveyard cards. It's also just, you realize that if you just ever cast a Muldrifter, you're never going to lose. So it's not been seen since any kind of comment close to this power level, and really I don't think we're going to see it again.
No, I don't think so either. It's funny. I mean, this card saw play in Standard when it was legal. In one of the most powerful Standard formats I've seen. It was, pretty early from when I came back, but I mean, this was a Standard format that had basically any color of mana you wanted.
Right. This was the Standard format where you were playing Cruel Ultimatum, which costs black, 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 blue, blue, red, red. Wrath of God, 2 white, white.
Cloud Thresher.
1 colorless, blue, 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 and Cloud Thresher, which is 2 colorless, green, 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 green.
So in the same deck.
It turns out you could cast spells of any color, of really any color, and all the colors, and Muldrifter still made the cut. Yeah. And actually, part of the reason the deck worked was Muldrifter. It got cast and constructed for 3 mana a lot. So yep. Muldrifter really is just the headliner. I mean, this is when people think value, they think Muldrifter. It's even one of the emotes in your Twitch channel. Like, it is. It's kind of.
Yes, Muldrifter, definitely one of my favorite cards of all time, and I think that it will stay atop my 3-for-1 list no matter what. But there's some other ones in here too. Treasure Cruise. This is Cruise.
7 and a blue sorcery with Delve. So you exile a card from a graveyard to make it 1 cheaper, and it draws 3 cards. Hideously broken and constructed in all the formats that had back lands that got banned. But rather, all the older than stand formats.
Yes.
Banned or restricted. But for limited, I think this card actually had some interesting lessons. One, it was not the kind of card draw spell that paid you if you weren't doing much. If you weren't doing much, Treasure was actually horrible. It would be like 6 mana in your hand. You could never cast it. But if you had a proactive deck that had a lot of cheap cards in it, this card was just made you fire on all cylinders. So I thought it was an interesting interplay where sometimes card draw is good at getting you out of bad draws or bad situations. Like Divination does make your deck more consistent because you just draw into what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. Cruise is kind of the opposite, where it paid you for your good draws.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I also learned just about the difference between like the huge gap in constructed and limited in this way, where it was a very fair, playable but not broken card. It was a mid pick, right? It wasn't like first pick Treasure Cruise was not obvious. You would rarely do that. And then if you threw it in a slightly different setting, like constructed, it just went nuts. The other Treasure Cruise, Thassa's Bounty.
Yes, this is 5 and a blue sorcery, draw 3 and mill 3. So what this taught me, because I tried to play this card, is that not all 3-for-1s are created equal.
That's correct.
Thassa's Bounty just wasn't good. Draw 3, 6 mana draw staff for that. 6 mana draw 3 is just not good enough. Even in a format that wasn't particularly fast, Theros Block was not a speedy format. Like heroic decks couldn't end it quickly, but a lot of the mid-range black-green type decks were slow, and yet Thassa's Bounty still not good enough. So it was a hard lesson to learn, but you even big card draw spells don't always get there.
Yeah. Now that was a card that looked like it would be a good top end type card. Like when I saw it, I thought, oh, well, this will be a nice way to, kind of power through to the late game and really, a decent place to put 6 mana. But it turns out that is just too expensive and too slow. A different type of 3-for-1 for our next one, Cone of Flame. Right. And Cone of Flame, when we think 3-for-1s, usually you and I have so far talked about, mainly drawing cards. We also have Muldrifter in there as a piece of the 3-for-1 puzzle there. But Cone of Flame doesn't draw you any cards. It just annihilates your opponent's board. It's 3 red for a sorcery. It says it deals 1 damage to target creature or player, 2 damage to another target creature or player, and 3 damage to a third target creature or player.
So Cone of Flame is a 3-for-1, and the reason I wanted to put it on the list was it actually taught me an example of a card that you can sideboard against fairly effectively. When your opponent plays a Cone of Flame, one way to make it not a 3-for-1, to make it into just a 2-for-1, still a good card, but just a 2-for-1, is to take out most or all of your 1 toughness creatures. Once they're not picking off a 2-1, all of a sudden their card that was, an A to an A plus is now like an A minus. Yeah, it doesn't sound big, but it's still one extra card for you.
Mm-hmm.
And turning their 3-for-1 into a 2-for-1 is huge. I actually played a game at a Grand Prix where it was actually team sealed, and it was M14 or M15, sorry, 15, whatever the format was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, M15. And I had this blue-green deck that had like 4 welcome turns, the 2/1 flyer that can't block non-flyers. Or can't block at all, I guess. I don't know.
Welcome Anyways, can block flyers, but not non-flyers.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I got Kona Flamed in game 1. And my post-board plan involved siding out Welkin turns for Grizzly Bears. Grizzly Bears is just a 2/2 for 2. It's much worse than Welkin turn, but I just didn't want to get Kona Flamed, and I thought that the matchup was pretty good otherwise. And then, we ended up in a spot where I didn't get 3-for-1 off Kona Flame. Like I don't know exactly how it would have played out had I had Welkin turn instead, but I know that sideboarding I felt gave me an edge in the matchup. And when you see your opponent play a great card like Kona Flame, don't just think, oh well, I can't beat that card. This sucks. You can think that it sucks, but you should also figure out the best way to improve your win percentage against it. I mean, I was still annoyed my opponent had Kona Flame.
The last time I played M15 was at the GP in Salt Lake, and you did commentary on a few of my games, and I got wrecked by that card. It was so bad. Kona Flame's amazing. I happen to be out.
It's too late for you to listen to this and sideboard.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
but hopefully, Marshall future will know about this.
I had I happened to be out at dinner while you and I were emailing about what 3-for-1s we wanted to highlight here, and Athena, that's right, Elantris. She said Sinister Concoction is her favorite 3-for-1 of all time.
All right, so I put it on the list because it's not a real 3-for-1.
It is definitely not. We had a good chuckle.
3 cards do go into your graveyard though, and only 1 card goes into theirs. But what it is a good lesson of turning drawbacks into advantages. Clearly, once you take Sinister Concoction away from discard a card and into Cast My Madness card, if you're discarding a card with Madness, yes, all of a sudden you're 1-for-1ing. Your Sinister Concoction is trading for their card, and then you're getting to Madness card, which is frequently a mana advantage in and of itself. So yeah,
just because Sinister Concoction's so cheap to actually cast.
I think it's funny. It's 3 cards for 1.
Yeah, it is. It's 3-for-1. She was right. One of my favorite ones, by the way, is from one of my favorite draft formats as well, and it's Dreamstone Hedron, which I think is really cool because it's a lot different than the other spells that we've got. It's 6 colorless mana. That's right, 6 for an artifact that taps to add 3 to your mana pool. Now, in the context of Rise of the Eldrazi, this made sense. in a normal limited format, that key interaction of getting from 6 to 9 mana doesn't normally pay too many dividends, but in that set it did. But then it's got also the ability that you can pay 3 colorless, tap it, and sacrifice it to draw 3 cards. So, you can turn it into 1 card Dreamstone Hedron and then 3 cards. But the thing that I learned, and the thing that I really like about cards like this, is that occasionally you'll get these big value cards, but the middle ground is actually really cool too, because this is a significant mana advantage, right? I mean, you're talking about going from 6 mana to 9 mana, maybe 10 if you play your land. And if you've got a bunch of cards in your hand, that leads to an absolutely explosive turn where you can just sort of empty your hand. Or if you have some huge bomb that costs 7, 8, 9 mana, you can cast it. And then the neat part is that once you've run out of gas, you can tap 3 mana, sack it, and get 3 cards in your hand. And usually you'll even have a few mana left over to maybe even cast one of those cards. And I like that. This is kind of an unlikely combination, the combination of ramp and then give you late game cards. But you got to look for it, right? You got to look for value in all the weird little spots. And this is a card that, it didn't stand out to me as one that you would think of just like a straight value card, because it's not. It plays out a little differently, but I've always thought that was a neat design. And there's, many versions of Dreamstone Hedron. Throughout time, there's like Mind Stone and the Hedron Archive, but the Dreamstone Hedron, of course, is the one that actually gets you the full 3-for-1.
I would even argue there's more than a 3-for-1, and therefore really eligible to be on the list. So we shouldn't talk about it.
Well, why don't you explain your argument, and then we'll vote.
What it is it's similar to other cards where the fact that you're tapping it from a almost gives you a card by itself, and later you cash in for 3. So I think you actually get more than 3 cards of value. You get the 3 cards of value later while you used it as a mana ramp. Also, the fact that it taps for 3 mana makes it worth almost more than a single. It's like more than a single land there. So I think that Dreamstone Hedron is a very good card, and yeah, it combines these things very nicely.
Another one that came up, there's been a lot of these type of cards. Eric said his favorite was Ancestral Recall. And,
Sure.
there's Ancestral Vision. And then there's, the air quote fixed versions with Harmonize and Concentrate, which are both, 4 mana, draw 3s, sorcery speed. And then there's the fixed version of Ancestral Recall, right? Which is Jace's Ingenuity. Which is kind of crazy to think of that because it costs 5 mana versus 1, but they are the same spell effectively. I mean, Ancestral Recall can target the opponent where Jason's Ingenuity cannot. But still, you're drawing 3 cards and at instant speed. In order to get that, it's 5 mana. And I thought that was an interesting one because it's probably one of the cleanest 3-for-1s that we have, in like modern Magic. It's literally just draw 3 cards.
Yeah, most of the cards in this list, I think, don't have a ton of interesting stuff going on. Like, Harmonize, Concentrate, Ancestral Recall. These are all just great cards, but they don't illustrate anything besides the fact that card draw is good. What Jason's Ingenuity does, which I think is very cool, is it was one of the cards that really bluntly shows off the advantage of having multiple expensive instants. Because if you have Jason's Ingenuity and Aether Spouts, to use an example of cards in the same set, if you have both those cards in your hand, your opponent does not have a great play to play around them. If they don't attack with anything, you just cast Ingenuity into their turn, and they missed an attack, and you drew 3 cards. If they attack with a bunch of creatures, you cast Aether Spouts. This is a card, for 3 blue, all attacking creatures on the top or bottom of the owner's library. So you end up in a spot where these 2 cards existing makes the other more camouflaged, and if you have both, you end up in a really good spot. This is the same. I guess we're just talking about cards from M15 because the same GP as the Cone of Flame. I actually had this come up where I had in the same deck, I had both those cards, and my opponent just didn't have a great play. Like they could either attack me and get either spouted or not attack, and I would cast Jason's Ingenuity. I don't even really do this that often. I actually just told my opponent that I have Aether Spouts.
You told them?
Yeah,
you can't tell your opponent what you have in your hand, Luis. What are you doing?
The best part is I actually got to do this on coverage. What happened was I was playing and it was the time shifted match. So our match ended, and then the coverage, which was going to be that match, that was going to be next. So me and Ben Stark were in the booth, and I was providing commentary of my match. And what had happened was, I passed with 5 mana up when my opponent knew I had a card in my hand that I could have played, like a sorcery, like a creature or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he was trying to think of should I attack or not? And I was like, well, I've got Aether Spouts. And he just looked at me and was like, what are you even talking about? Why would you even tell me that? He didn't even know I had Aether Spouts in my deck. And he's like, whatever. You wouldn't tell me. This doesn't make any sense. And he just attacked. And I'm like, I play the Aether Spouts. And I just look at him like, I told you I had Aether Spouts.
It's so rude.
I don't know why. I like I said, I actually don't really do that very often. But I felt I just wanted to run it. So
that is really funny. And you recommend doing this for our listeners? You're trying to set the example for them, or?
If you really want to, you can, but for the most part, I do not. I do not recommend. But I did have Jason Ingenuity in my hand too, so that's why I said it actually, because either he would attack and get blown up by Aether Spouts and just just be wondering what exactly I was up to, why did I even say that, or he would believe me and not attack, and I would cast Jason Ingenuity, and then it would also go on tilt. So no matter what.
Man. Wow. The second option, even better than the first, because he's like, oh, that's what you had. And then he attacks next turn, and then you Aether Spouts him, and it's just ridiculous.
Exactly.
Oh, man, you do know how to get your value. All right, so those were our favorite 3-for-1s. We've got a couple of mini level ups here as well. We thought, the 3-for-1 episode, we wanted to give you multiple smaller topics, so we're going to dive into a couple of those now. And the first one,
and these are level ups that also wouldn't necessarily fit as their own show, but they have enough meat in them to be worth drawing multiple in the same show.
Yeah, we do get these suggestions quite often, hey, can you guys do a show where you talk about this? And we'll often have that reaction where Luis and I will fire a text or an email to each other and be like, there's something here, but it's probably not a full show worth of material. And we don't, you know, we don't like to just we don't want to take a topic that doesn't warrant a full show and try to like expand it out into a full show, because it just feels like you lose some of the meat of the discussion when you do that. So we thought, well, hey, if you're going to get a 3-for-1, then you might as well get some level up action here too. And we've got a couple of those here. The first one is on risk aversion. Why don't you kick us off with that one, Luis?
So, not to...
Since I'm not risk averse at all.
Right. Not to derail the show at all, but this was really highlighted with the looter problem. I'm not even kidding here. Like the looter problem that I kind of touched on last week, it basically the most common reason I see people not make plays, or not the most common, but a very common reason is people tend to overvalue plays that don't lead to losses. They tend to try to stay away from plays that have what they consider a high risk of ruin. So, these are plays where if it works, then that's great. But if it doesn't, you just lose. Or if it doesn't, something really bad happens. The thing is, that doesn't sound good, obviously. But if you're looking at multiple different plays, you're actually just looking for the one that gives you the highest chance to win the game, not the one that gives you the lowest chance to lose the game. Those aren't exactly the same thing.
No, they're actually quite different. And also, I think that, to go like one little step deeper into the sentence that you said about the highest chance to win the game, there is a difference between that and trying to win the game, right? Which I think often gets translated in people's heads into to not losing the game, right? Which is there is this weird mental shift that happens where you make a play, and if you were to pause time and ask yourself, or have somebody else ask you, well, why did you make that play? I think that a lot of time, the bottom of that question is, well, I'm trying to win the game. But what you should really be doing is trying to give yourself the biggest percentage to win the game. And that is a subtle difference, but it actually is it signals a different mental approach to it, because you can make plays in a game that try to have you actually win it, right? Like a game winning play or a line of play that you think, you see, well, I could win the game if this, and this happens. But if you're consistently actually making the play that gives you the highest percentage in your mind to win the game in the long run, that is different. And it's interesting, because this is where that risk aversion starts to really kind of creep up, which is that, when you take the approach of, I think that this play gives me the highest percentage to win the game in the long term, right? Then the risk part of it, if you're playing properly, doesn't really apply. You understand that there's a risk involved, but you also understand that there's a reward. If you take that off the table and you try to make plays that just win you the game, like, with using the mechanics of Magic and that kind of thing, you're probably going to give up those percentage points, because the times when you look at it and say, but I'm not likely to win the game if I make this play, then I will not make this play, is not answering the question, right? The question being, what's the play that gives me the highest percentage chance to win the game? And that might be a risky all-in type play. But the difference is that the person who's looking to try to win the game will say, well, I probably won't win the game if I make this play, so I'm not going to make it. And there's a very discernible difference between the players who understand that they're trying to maximize the win percentage versus the players who are like, I'm trying to literally find a way to win this game right now, and that doesn't do it very often, so I'm not going to do that.
Right. You're just describing the other side of this play might lose me the game.
Exactly.
And that's something I think is really important to avoid, because it's so easy to focus on downsides. People this is just natural human psychology. People tend to focus more on things they'll lose than things they'll gain. People or like, even if you look at money, like people are less likely to risk money when there's a chance of losing it than even if the expected value is much higher. Like there's been a number of experiments that demonstrate this, and it's just true in Magic too. Like people would rather they'd rather take a guaranteed $5 than have a flip a coin for a chance of $20 or $0. And in Magic, if you're trying to win more, you want to take more of the flips where it's 20 or 0 because the average is 10 than the average of 5. Yeah, the average of 5 means that you're winning some games, but you're losing a lot of games, whereas the the 20 or 0 flip with an average of 10 is much higher overall.
Yeah, and that's where it gets interesting, because some of the things that you have to do in a game of Magic, go further than that, right? I mean, they, like where it's, maybe it's a 10%er, right?
Some are very uncomfortable. You have to make plays that aren't very likely to succeed, because that's their best chance of winning this particular game. So again, you should divorce yourself from the chance of an individual play succeeding, more like, and you want to look at the big picture of winning the game. So, like, what are your chances to win this game? And we've talked about how before many times, the worse you're doing in a game, the riskier your plays have to become, and the higher your risk tolerance has to become. Because if I were to tell you right now, like, hey, would you do this play that gives you a 10% chance of winning the game? You would probably say, no, that doesn't sound very good. Mm-hmm. But I'm like, well, what if I give you additional information? You're 5% to win this game.
Right.
Then you're like, wow, I just doubled my win percentage. That sounds great. So,
right.
An example.
But the thing is that the play you're making at the time means, like, the way that it like if you were able to show up and ask somebody that question with those percentages is solid, right, they would be like, oh, I'll take it then, right? I'm doubling my chance to win, even if it's only from 5 to 10%. That's going to add up over the long term. And yes, I will take your offer, Luis. I will take my 10% chance instead of my 5% chance. You're like, okay, great, sign here, book it. The problem comes in of when you're actually playing a game of Magic. What does that play look like, right? And what it looks like most of the time is craziness. It looks like I attack with everything, right? I lose 4 of my creatures in this exchange to get you down to 7. And now I know that in my deck, right, I have 3 cards that will get me through for that extra 7 damage if you don't draw something that interacts with my creatures. So all of those things have to go right in order for you to win the game. You're 5% or something like that. You're a very low percentage. But And when you make that play, it doesn't feel good. It feels crazy. It feels like everything we tell you on the podcast, everything you've ever learned about Magic says you should not attack your creatures into their creatures if they have good blocks and you don't have anything to do about it. But that's what that play looks like. And that's where the risk aversion thing that we're really hammering on comes in, because anybody would take the deal of just like, doubling their percentage, but not everybody has the ability to recognize it and follow through on it when it makes them look dumb or when it goes against their, sort of fundamental magic. And they, have to recognize, well, this is the time where I need to throw those rules out and try to scrap out a few more percentage points that, like you said, Luis, won't work most of the time. Like, you understand that even if you make this play, you're still only going from 5 to 10%. That means 9 out of 10 times that you make this play, you're going to lose the game, right? And that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people.
Yeah, this extends even to games where you're not like horribly behind too.
Yes, sliding scale for sure.
But another example is both you and your opponent both have a bunch of creatures out. They have 1 card in their hand they just drew for their turn and passed. If you attack with everything and your opponent doesn't have anything, then you win the game. If they had drawn like a removal spell or a bounce spell, then you probably just lose the game. You lose all your creatures. You're attacking a horde of 2/2s into a horde of 3/3s with 1 getting through and your opponent at 2. So if they have anything, you just lose your whole board. A lot of people would be less inclined to make that because of the downside seems so big. If they have anything, you lose. But you have to think like, why do you think that you're going to win the game if you don't do anything? At this point, you're just hoping you draw better than your opponent, and that doesn't get, and they're getting the first draw step because you just drew for your turn. It's a land, and you have to decide whether to attack or not. If you don't, then they draw a card, they draw another card, and people are going to be way more focused on what happens if this doesn't work than what happens if it does. When it does, you win the game. You also have to look at something like, if you don't attack because you're worried about them having a removal spell, well, if the card in their hand is a removal spell, you're in even more trouble because then they already have a removal spell. They're already up a card, and then next turn, if they draw another card and it's another action card, then you almost just can't win the game. So you're almost in a position where you just have to hope they don't have a removal anyway because you probably can't beat it.
That's a great example, by the way, because that's I think the scenario that comes up the most often that puts you in this conundrum of, do I want to risk this or not? That comes up a lot, right? And we're talking, of course, about, you have 6 creatures and they have 5 and they're at 1 or whatever. And you have to decide.
Don't have the fear.
Yeah. And, I will say that was a big lesson that I learned coming up, pretty quickly was, look, break this down to what's important, right? And like you said, oftentimes If they have the spell that you don't want them to have, it's not good. Also, this gives you a chance to leverage information that you have that your opponent doesn't, which is what's left in your deck, right? Is there a Magmatic Chasm waiting in there that you could draw? Because, generally speaking, when you find yourself in that scenario where you've got your opponent almost dead and you have like maybe one more creature than them, they can't attack you basically forever, right? Like, not only is it not beneficial for them to attack their creatures into your horde of blockers, but also they're taking on tremendous risk by turning any of their creatures sideways, because anything gets through from you and you can win the game. But if in your deck, I've got 3 flyers left, I've got an unblockable creature, and I have a lightning bolt. Right. That's a lot of cards, out of your, say, 25 card library that's left or whatever it is, that you can use to win the game, and to say to yourself, I'm not going to make this attack, because if this attack goes wrong, if my opponent does have the thing that I hope that they don't have, I'm probably going to lose the game as a result. And I've got all these options, all these things in my deck that can get me there. But if you're one of those, really quick, like, aggro decks, sort of a cheap 2-drop style aggro deck, and you look at your cards in hand, you look at the cards on your library, on the battlefield, and you think about the cards in your deck, you're like, well, I've got a bunch of 2/2s, I've got a 5-drop, but it doesn't get through this board, and I don't really have any way to push through damage otherwise. This is where you want to start thinking to yourself, things are probably going to get slowly worse and worse and worse for me here. And I might want to take the risk on and go ahead and make the attack, try to leverage that early damage that I've gotten. And again, this is you being able to leverage the fact that what's in your deck, what kind of cards you can draw versus not, and try to make a correct decision based on that.
Right. And then the reverse of all this is also true, by the way, which is I feel like instead of focusing on the negative and not making the bold plays they need to, people actually go the other way too hard, which is once things start going badly, people just start playing way too recklessly and they look for excuses to lose. So this is more just like, don't fly off the handle. But like, you've seen it when someone mulligans and then they mulligan again, and then all of a sudden they're like, well, whatever, I just mulled a 5, and then they just play terribly as a follow-up, or they...
Dude, I've seen that so many times.
Or people like mull to 6, and then their 6 isn't good, and they just like snap mull it, but when it's actually keepable, but they're already just like in the mindset of like, I'm just mulling a bunch this game. Mm-hmm. So it's a minor point, but don't confuse the need to not focus on downsides with playing recklessly once you're already in a bad position. So those aren't quite the same thing.
But yeah, I really like this as a mini topic, because we've kind of said what we wanted to say about it, but the thing that it really hits on for me is it relates so closely to so many of the things that we talk about on LR, and we've talked about since the inception of LR, which are, is there a name for these things, Luis? The tendency for your brain to think and do things and tell you things that are incorrect, like under closer examination, like results-oriented thinking and that kind of thing.
I don't specifically know what
the
term would be.
I don't either, but you know what I mean, right? Like the things where, that your brain kind of has these fallacies built into it, where there probably some, the theory that I've read is that it's like survival instinct type stuff, right? Where you're like, look, if something goes bad for you, and you don't go back and do that thing again, you're probably just more likely to survive in the aggregate than the person who just keeps going back to the bad thing over and over again, right? And so it's like, that's a very basic and probably way too stripped down version of whatever the real truth is, but there's something to that. And, to me, part of being a great gamer is fighting and understanding and eventually, hopefully, doing away with these tendencies for you to, I mentioned a second, results-oriented thinking, right? I did something, it didn't work, therefore it's bad, right? We know that that's not true. We can show that empirically that is not the case, and that there's all these other things like sample size and being rigorous and understanding all the variables and everything that you need to know before you can make an educated, actual decision on that situation. And, this risk aversion absolutely falls into that. You just get scared. You do. And I'll tell you what, watch any Magic player who's just starting play. They're scared of everything. Like they chump block right away because they want to keep their life total up. Once they learn a few more of the cards, they'll just refuse to attack. Even though like there's really no reason not to. Like they're afraid of, Ryan used to call it like the mysterious haste monster or whatever, like doesn't even exist in the format. And they'll just sit back. And if you ask them why, they're like, well, I don't want to get attacked and lose or whatever. And it's like, well, to a more experienced Magic player, you have to come up with a pretty specific set of circumstances where you actually get punished for attacking in a lot of those sort of early game scenarios where your opponent doesn't have a board, but you see people do it. And as you work your way down the pipeline of being a better and better player, this is one I think that gets advanced players even too, is that risk aversion. They just don't want to put it on the line, even though if they were to pause time and break it all down, they would realize that it's correct to do so and that they're actually going to win more games as a result. It still feels weird to do, and you have to work on, getting your brain over that hump.
Most certainly.
All right, let's go to the next mini topic. This is kind of a weird one, Luis. This one's a little less clear-cut, I think, than the risk aversion one. And this is the concept of when to give your opponents a choice. So why don't you talk us through this?
So it doesn't come up all that often, but it certainly does come up where you're in a situation where you can either let your opponent make a choice or force them to do something. And in general, it feels like, well, you should just force your opponent to do something. Why would you give them a choice? Mm-hmm. Like the heuristic actually would certainly be that, in that if you're gonna either force your opponent to make one of, there's two plays right on the board, and you can either eliminate one and force your opponent to make the other one, or give them the option to do either. You should give them you should only give them the option to do one, because
that's the 85% of the time correct play, right?
Right, because it's just strictly better from the point of view, of if your opponent has a choice, then you might as well force them to do the one that they have to do. And then that way, if they have something else, if they have the other information, they're not going to make, they might make the other choice, which could be worse for you. But sometimes sometimes it's actually better to give your opponent a choice, because they might make the wrong play. If there's a good play and a bad play, you don't necessarily want to take the bad play off the table. So even though against an opponent who understands all this stuff, they're going to come to the right conclusion. But against an opponent who maybe doesn't realize why one of the plays is bad, it actually could work out. And there's some interesting psychology stuff that goes into this. One example I've got here is you have Kozilek's Shrieker out. This is the 3/2. You can pay a colorless to give it +1/+0 and menace, so your opponent would have to double block.
Yep.
Your opponent's at 4, and you've got a colorless source. So if you attack with it, they have to block. Your opponent has 2 1/1s. So if you give it menace, let's say your opponent's completely tapped out.
Okay.
If you give it menace and attack, your opponent just has to double block.
Mm-hmm.
They trade their 2 1/1s for a Shrieker. That's it. That's the end of the story. You can force them to do that. They have no option there. So let's walk through all the scenarios of what each player could be thinking if you just attack with the 3/2 by itself.
Okay. So you do not activate it and you just attack it into the 2 1/1s.
Right.
Okay.
So your opponent knows that you could spend a colorless, which you have, to make it a 4/2 and force them to double block. So the first thing I would think of as the opponent, as the person with the 2 1/1s, is they could have forced me to double block. Why didn't they? You have to look at that. This is what you should be doing whenever your opponent does something. This just holds true in Magic. When your opponent does something, try to figure out why. They're giving you information. They're giving you free information. You should use it. So as the opponent, my first thought is they did not force me to double block with the 2 1/1s because they think I'm going to anyway, and they don't want to spend the mana. Because maybe they need the colorless mana, or it's their 7th land and they have a 7-drop, and they know that if I activate it and double block, if they activate it, I have to double block. So why not just not activate it, and I'll probably double block anyway, because it generally looks better to block the 3/2 with 2 1/1s.
Yeah, for sure. And then what the person who has the Shrieker's doing is saving themselves a mana.
Right. But imagine you're the person with a Shrieker and you don't care about the mana, but you have a card that gives your creature like a +2/+0 and trample. Mm-hmm. So if they double block, +1/+0 and trample. If they double block, they survive. But if they block with just 1 token, then you win. Uh-huh. So you might be trying to bait them into blocking with just 1 token.
Yes.
So there's actually a better play for you on the table that is then forcing your opponent to block. So as the opponent, if that card existed, like again, we're not talking theoreticals because I don't think there was a +1/+0 and trample card in the Oath of the Gatewatch format, but there was like brute strength of +3/+1, but whatever. So I'm thinking, well, maybe they're trying to trick me into blocking with just one so they can cast this trample card and kill me. And if this was a card that existed, I would have to think about that.
Yeah, for sure.
In general, I would say, given this information, it's probably best to double block with the 2/1/1s because I think the most likely scenario by far is you're just saving the mana. But even if the mana didn't matter, there could be reasons to play otherwise. And here every time someone forces someone to do something, you have to think about that information.
Yeah, and I think that's also just a skill to note those times, right? Like to say, hold on a second. On board, my opponent could have made me do something, and they're not. And this shouldn't be the spot where you're just like double block or single block. You shouldn't make a snap decision in those spots because, like you said, they're giving you information. You should use it, right? Like that should raise a flag where you're like, hold on a second. You didn't activate this. I am now able to block. And they're like, yes. Why? Right? Like what? Like this doesn't make any sense. I'm supposed to double block here. You decided not to force me. What is it that you could have? And I think that getting to the point where you don't treat that as any other combat step where your opponent's just attacking and you have the option to block or not, like in any other combat. This is I think a skill, to be worked on of I think what most players happen. I'm sure this happened to you, Luis, as well, which is that you develop sort of that spidey sense, that tingle, that like, wait a minute, something's wrong here. But I know that for quite a while for me, I would have that feeling but still just proceed as normal. And then afterwards go, well, God, I knew something was up. I was like, oh, that's weird. Double block. Right. But I just never really, trained myself early to pause and say, now, wait a second, something weird is going on. There has to be a reason. And I think it's definitely worth noting here that, pay attention to that little thing in the back of your head. Because when these scenarios pop up, it's not that often, but when they do, it usually means that there's something to be gained, at least informationally from it.
And it's kind of funny. It's almost a double-edged sword. In that example, both players were giving up information. And when your opponent, basically where this comes up most is when your opponent has a play they could force you to make, but they give you an option. Just think, why did they give you that option? What are they trying to get me to do? I have a pretty good story for this, actually, that really it's using some slightly older cards, but really does demonstrate the kind of like the different levels of thinking. Okay. So I'm actually playing against Paul Tian. This is actually a playtest game. Okay. And he's completely tapped out, and he has an Ancestral Vision suspended on 1. So it's got 1 counter on it. On his next upkeep, he's casting Ancestral Vision. Target player draws 3 cards.
A 3-for-1.
It's a 3-for-1. Yeah, that's perfect for the upside. So I pass the turn. He untaps. Before the last counter comes off, I cast Pull from Eternity. It's a instant for 1 white that puts a suspended card or an exiled card into the opponent's graveyard. So basically, it counters the suspended Ancestral Vision.
Okay.
And Qian has a counterspell in his hand. He has exactly 1 counterspell. And he's about to counter it, but he's like, you could have done this while I was tapped out. He was completely tapped out on him.
Yeah.
He's like, why didn't you do it when I was tapped out? You knew that the Pull for Eternity would resolve. And he thinks, and he's like, I know what's happening. You have Imp's Mischief in your hand, which is a card that just redirects any target spell. He's like, you want me to counter a Pull from Eternity and then redirect. Then you're going to redirect Ancestral to yourself.
Oh, and that way, if all Qian has is just the one way to interact here, then you're going to blow him out and get all the cards.
Right. So what he did, he concluded that he concluded it wasn't an accident that I didn't cast this card when he was tapped out, and he concluded that the last card in my hand had to be Imp's Mischief, and so he just let the Pull from Eternity resolve. He didn't counter it. Turned out the last card in my hand was Imp's Mischief.
So he just put the read on you.
He did, but look. So here's what happened.
Insane. That's really cool.
Yeah, it was a really cool moment. And here's what happened in that exchange. 1, I traded Pull from Eternity for Ancestral. That was on the table either way. Mm-hmm. If I had done it when he was tapped out, I would have gotten that trade. Yep. So that's neutral for both of us, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that was going to happen under both scenarios. But the second is actually not good for me. I let him know that I had Imp's Mischief in my hand because he figured it out.
Right.
Did
you feel like you were taking on risk by opening that door? And is the hope that he just sort of autopilots his way through and goes, well, I can't let him do this, counter?
Yes.
Okay.
I was taking on risk, and this is kind of where you have to know your audience too.
Very much so.
Paul was good enough that he not only didn't fall for my trap, he then deduced what I had and and now has that information the rest of the game, which is much more valuable.
God, but man, what if you're just random player at round 3 of a GP or whatever?
Right. That's the thing. Is
That's where it gets really.
He had to know it was me doing it, and that it was within my range to try to like trick him. So these are the kind of like intricate like leveling games that, again, we're not saying these happen every game, and we're not saying that this is what you should completely always try to train for. But the basic thing that's happening here is actually just one of the keys of Magic, which is your opponent's giving you information, and you have to interpret that information. When your opponent attacks a 2/2 into a 3/3, you get information. Mm-hmm. When your opponent declines to block your 2/2 with their 2/1, or vice versa, you're getting information. When they don't block your 2/2 with their 2/1, it means that they think that they're going to race or they need a creature in play, because normally that would be a good exchange. Yeah. It's like all of these things give you information, and how you interpret that information, what you do with it, is what's important. So
yeah, you know how I like to view these things, Luis, is like I view it as a conversation. Yeah. Which I know is a weird way to view it, right? But this actually came from poker, which was that, I think in any game, you eventually get to the comfort level with the game so that you can start doing what you just said, which is interpreting other players' actions. And I was teaching somebody about poker, who knew the rules but didn't really play at a very high level. And I said, okay, this is how we're going to do this. I'm going to translate what these bets mean. And I actually did this live at a poker table where I was not in the hand. It was actually just kind of funny because the players in the hand got a really big kick out of it. But, there's a subtlety to Magic and a subtlety to games like poker that have this, we call it leveling, the thing that Luis, he referenced it a couple of times, which is where, that's like where you're next leveling your opponent. You're like, I know that you know that I know, that whole, exchange. And this happens in poker as well. And, somebody would make a raise and I would say, what that person's saying is they don't believe what you're saying, and that you're probably wrong, and that they're willing to put you to the test to back that up. And then the other person raises back and they're saying, I do have what I said, I promise. And then, the other person folds and they say, okay, I believe you. Or they re-raise all in and they say, I don't believe you. This is kind of the conversational nature. And you can start to do this for Magic as well. You mentioned a scenario where, you attack with your 2/2 into their 2/1 and they decline to block you, right? One of the things that might pop into your head there is like, shrug, oh, that's kind of weird. Or, I thought they were going to block, I guess not. But what you really can garner from that in many ways is like, well, this opponent wants to race me, or this creature is important to them in some other way rather than attacking and blocking, because, maybe that would have been a trade that you would expect them to make. You also will have these really distinct turning points in games, especially, when an opponent decides to say attack with both of their creatures, offering a trade, even though you were ahead on life total. Like, this is a big signal that they intend to race you, and that they feel that they have the tools in their hand to beat you in that race. And up until that point, you may have felt as a player who was ahead on board and ahead on life total that you were going to win a race pretty easily. And once they go attack, now all of a sudden they're kind of declaring war on you. They're saying, all right, we're racing. And you can certainly deduce that they have some tools in their hand that are going to aid them in that, whether it's just, faster creatures than you have, or a well-timed removal spell, or maybe it's something like, a Silver Strike or whatever, where they're like gaining life and killing one of your creatures. There's going to be something that they think, is going to be able to win them that. But if you're just playing the game on the very surface level and not really ever interpreting these things, you're just like, oh, that was pretty aggressive, attack with both creatures, right? But you may want to reconsider. You may want to say, look, I know this player's good. They think they can race with the cards they have in their hand. You look at your hand, it's maybe not that great, and you think they're probably right. They probably can race, so I'm not going to. I'm going to block, or I'm going to, just pump the brakes and try to get to the later part of the game where I have these cards, or, whatever. But I do find that super interesting because, like, you just mentioned it with the example with Paul, is that he looked at it and didn't just assume you were just randomly casting spells. He said, well, what is Luis telling me here? And he was able to figure it out. And I think that, like, once you get proficient at kind of understanding that language of a game, you really can start to answer the questions that those type of scenarios put forth a lot better than, when you're still just sort of looking at it as a bunch of mechanical interactions or whatever.
Right. From the top level, Paul's choice was, do I counter a spell that's countering my draw 3? Yes.
Right. Which is like, absolutely. Right. It's just like,
but a level deeper, and he got there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, he even went one step further, right? By actually sorting through, like, not only did he figure out, well, I'm being tricked here in some way. like this doesn't make sense. And Luis has something, but he even was able to pinpoint exactly what it was that you had that was tricking him, which is, I mean, that's just excellent play, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that can come together when you've put in the practice, when you are a high level player, when you've bothered to think about what your opponent's doing, and when you know the set or the decks or whatever it is very well. All of these things combine, to make a really great play like the one that Paul made there. That's a sweet example, by the way.
It's one of the betters.
I like that. It also wasn't bad for you though, right? Like you were going to get the thing either way.
No, it wasn't bad for me, but it was worse than if I hadn't tried to make that play.
Was it? I don't know. I feel like you kind of free-rolled
definitely better because I've told the story so many times.
Yeah, you got a lot of story equity. All right. So what are the takeaways here from this? Just to make sure that you're, always thinking about what your opponent's doing.
Yeah, like, I mean, that's the main takeaway is really just when your opponent gives you information, use it. But in terms of choices, you're going to run into situations in Magic where your opponent or you can force the other person to make a choice. When they don't, this is just one of the clearest cut places where it's like, well, they're doing this for a reason.
Yeah.
Like you change any of the variables in that story with Paul, and like if he had mana up, then he wouldn't necessarily have thought anything of it because doing it on upkeep would make sense. But because he was tapped out, he all of a sudden it just was so clear that I was doing this for a reason. So the places where you'll find the most interesting information exchanges are when someone gives someone a choice they don't have to give them.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool. That was fun. I am definitely a fan of our value episodes. I did also, before we kind of wrap this thing up, I did want to take just a moment to just reflect and say thanks to all the listeners and to everybody who's helped make Limited Resources such a special part of my life. This is 341 episodes. We started the show in 2009 with Ryan Spain. Then we moved to John Laux, Brian Wong, and then Luis eventually. And I've been there for the whole ride, every episode we've done. And, I mean, it's grown every time. And, both in number of listeners and also for me personally, just in its role in my life where, when we first started it out, it was very much just a side hobby. I mean, I was recording this thing on my laptop. I had never recorded anything of any type ever. And we just did it because Ryan and I wanted to do it. And, we were having these limited conversations anyway, and we wanted to kind of get his name out there. And then it just stuck around. And I always go back to the big moment for me, Luis, was when Ryan left the show and I was going to be done with it. I was like, well, it served its role. It was a fun ride, but like Limited Resources is me and Ryan and he's leaving. So I'm just like, well, I guess we're done here. And, I had kind of kicked that around and I got just like a ton of feedback saying, no, like you can't take the show away from us or whatever. And I thought, well, I like doing it. It's not that I want to stop. It's just, where am I supposed to go now? I don't have a thing. And, there's no co-host. I don't know. And then, eventually, I found John Laux, Zame introduced me to him and John and I hit it off immediately. And, now it's just become like this huge part of my life. I mean, I've made it, a big chunk of my career at this point, and I feel like super lucky because I didn't have to start the show, right? Like that never had to happen. That was just a thing. It was just an idea that Ryan and I had at poker one night. It was like, well, we should just try this. And I'm like, yeah, I like this type of stuff. And I had listened to podcasts at the time for a few years and I thought, well, maybe I'd like to give it a shot. It sounds like a really fun thing. And I was inspired, by some other podcasters and broadcasters back in the day, a local DJ here in Seattle named BJ Shea, who's, by the way, also a Magic player. And then also this guy named Leo Laporte, who does a full channel. I mean, he was one of the pioneers of podcasting, and I listened to his podcast when I worked I drove a delivery truck and I would drive around listening to his podcasts all day at the time. I mean, this was way back in the day now, but that kind of stuff. He was, he does a tech podcast, about like Apple and technology and computers and stuff like that. And I like that kind of stuff. And, the thing that he always hammered home that really stuck with me was just the fact that things were now different, right? That you could now produce things on your own where like when for example, he's older and when he was coming up, going through radio, like you just had to get a job at a radio station and work at midnight and, in the middle of, some little town, out of the middle of nowhere where nobody was listening to you, and just grind it out for 15 years until you would get like a shaky job in a semi-big city talking about what you wanted. And, the thing that he really hammered home was that, like, with the advent of powerful computers, right? I mean, computers have been around forever, but like these were computers that could actually process like audio, video, and, the software had caught up to the point where you could actually make this stuff. And he's just like, anybody can do this now. And that really stuck with me, because that's the kind of thing that you see on like an inspirational poster, you can do it, but it was like real. It was like, no, I can sit down and I can actually make a radio show, and there's ways to distribute this. And, I had always been interested. And I remember just thinking back, like if I hadn't listened to those shows, it probably never would have occurred to me, but, I'm really glad I did. And I'm really glad that I've had, all of the awesome co-hosts that I've had. And of course, everybody, all you listeners from all the way back then, way back in the early days of LR, have made it incredibly special run. And I'm hoping to be able to do it for at least another 341 episodes. So thanks so much for coming along for the ride. And Luis, I love you, buddy. Thanks for the shows that you've done too.
Yeah, joining the podcast is one of I think the best decisions that I made, and I'm glad you went along with it.
Yeah. It didn't take much convincing to me. I'm like, wait, that's an option? Let's do that.
I haven't been with the podcast obviously nearly as long as you are. What was my first episode? It was like 200 and something.
Yeah, I mean, you've been on for a long time. Like, I don't know. Like, I haven't looked.
I know that it was January 2014, so it's actually been 2.5 years. Is that really true?
God, that cannot be true. Is that true?
Oh, it was, end of 2014. So it's been 1.5 years. Yes, that makes more sense. Yeah, it was, we announced it at GP Denver, which was the end of 2014. And so January 2015 was the first episode.
Do you remember when we announced it?
Mm-hmm.
That was so fun. We got the clearance to announce it at the GP that CFB was running. And I remember
we were doing coverage.
Yeah, we were doing coverage, and we got to go on, and we kind of had some fun with it and joked around. But I remember thinking like, okay, that was cool. Like, cause I was really excited about it, right? Like I thought this is going to be awesome. And like, I was really excited to bring you on, but then the Twitter, the feedback on social media was just awesome. I mean, it was like overwhelmingly awesome that people were just like, this is so exciting. This is so cool. I remember I have really, really fond memories of that GP just for that. I think the thing is that it caught me off guard. Like I knew people would be like, oh, sweet. But it wasn't just that. It was like a big response. I was like, whoa, like people are as excited as I am for this. And yeah, of course, everybody ended up coming with us. Anyway, yeah, I won't drone on. I just wanted to say thanks for everybody for coming along for the ride. And hopefully we do 341 more episodes. As
long as you don't lie to the listeners and promise not to drone on, because
hashtag scam artist.
We know that's going to
happen. With that note, that will do it for the show this week. If you guys want to get a hold of us, it's easy. Social media, specifically Twitter. I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast on lrcast.com, including the Patreon and all the other stuff. We've really expanded out the YouTube channel. That's where the Marshlock VOD clips go. That's where I'm working on the next depth check. That's the deep dive drafts that I do. I've got the stuff recorded for that, and I've started poking around at that, so that's going to be sweet. You can find all that stuff on lrcast.com. And of course, the show is brought to you every week by channelfireball.com, our sponsor. And I also want to thank CFB for being a great sponsor of the podcast, and urge you to go check them out for your magic needs. They are reliable. They will take care of you. They get your stuff shipped out to you quickly. They've got great prices. You can sell your cards to them. You can find awesome free content. I mean, they just really do it all. And I think they are the best site, the best magic site on the internet. And I wouldn't say that unless I meant it. So please do check out Channel Fireball. That's going to do it. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.
Well, speaking of the history of the podcast, imagine for a second we're in an alternate universe, or let's say a different version of the simulation. you and I could be doing a very different podcast, but it will stick to the core principles. And this, of course, is the LR, the Love and Relationships podcast. So
this is what we're doing.
This is what we're doing. Me and you. Every week we're talking about love and relationships, and
we need new intro music.
Yeah, slightly sexier intro music.
Yeah, a little slower, a little candle music. Yeah.
And this came about because one of our friends, BK, claimed that he was good at reading signals when dating, thanks to the show. So I have to thank him for the inspiration. So what would we be talking about on love and relationships? Well, one is a lesson that we talk about very frequently on Limited Resources. Don't get married to your first pick. We don't mean that literally when we talk about it, but it actually plays here. See, your first pick's the one you have the least information on. So if you stay overly attached to it, it can actually be disastrous.
Oh, man.
So in life, much like in booster drafts, sometimes you do get married to your first pick. And that's great. Your first pick's usually very good. But just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Another lesson that we try to impart is you have to read the signals. It's definitely better to read the signals of the table to find your lane and see what options you have available, as opposed to going into the draft with, let's say, a foregone conclusion or a one-track mind. You really have to adapt to what you're saying. And likewise, you have to learn from previous draft mistakes. Sometimes you try something new and different in drafts. Sometimes it pans out great. Sometimes it's a disaster. So you really have to learn from your mistakes so the next draft goes better.
The next draft goes better.
This is a really important one. You need to draft for synergy over power.
Oh my god.
Some cards might look appealing by themselves, but you'd really have to figure out how they fit into your overall game plan. The flashiest card is not always the best card for your deck.
Oh, that is very true.
It's also important to find the right time to commit. It's okay to stay open and see what comes your way, but at some point, if you don't commit, then you might end up with a pretty dysfunctional deck. Luckily, you always have the option of joining another draft. Sometimes you draft the train wreck.
Did we put something in about filing for compensation?
Yes, you can file for compensation if the draft goes too poorly. But, you can always join another draft.
Oh,
but
man.
on that subject, double queuing. The podcast doesn't take a firm stance against double queuing, but we just advise you that if you double queue, you have to worry about timing out. And that brings you your love and relationship podcast for the week. We'll do a level up show next week.